In 1987, that hillside was covered edge to edge in gorse, a spiny, fast-spreading shrub so despised that Parliament had outlawed it decades earlier. Farmers burned it. They sprayed it. They bulldozed it by the hectare. And every single time, it grew back thicker than before. So when a lone botanist bought the land and announced he wasn't going to touch the gorse at all, his neighbors didn't just disagree. They predicted disaster, thorns spreading across the entire peninsula, farms failing one by one. That's not what happened. Today, that same hillside is 1,700 hectares of closed canopy native rainforest. Waterfalls that had been dry for generations are running again, year-round, nearly 50 of them. And the gorse? It's almost entirely gone. Nobody cut it down. It vanished on its own, as if the land had turned the invader into the instrument of its own undoing. Here's the part almost no one saw coming. The thorny weed that farmers spent nearly a century trying to destroy may have been the one thing standing between the native forest and total collapse. Underneath those thorns, something was quietly happening that would take decades to reveal itself, and it would end up rewriting what scientists thought they knew about restoring damaged land. To understand how a hated weed became the engine of its own extinction, we have to go back to the moment a tired, degraded hillside first started fighting for its life. I wanted to know how bad it had actually gotten before Wilson arrived, so I went looking for the paper trail, and it went back further than I expected. New Zealand's parliament had labeled gorse a noxious weed all the way back in 1900. That's not a footnote. That's 87 years of official policy, aimed at one plant. For nearly 9 decades, the instructions never changed. Burn it, spray it, bulldoze it, repeat. Farmers followed those instructions to the letter. They cleared hillsides by hand. They ran fire breaks along the ridgelines. They doused paddocks in chemical spray, season after season. And the gorse kept winning. Every clearing just opened fresh soil for new seed. Every fire cracked open pods that had sat dormant for years. The harder they fought it, the faster it spread, until it wasn't a weed problem anymore. It was 53% of the property. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and join us as we uncover how animals continue to reshape the world around us. Then a trust fund accountant named Morris White bought the ruined land to save native birds, and hired a young botanist who was about to break every rule in that 87-year playbook. Here's what took me longest to understand. Gorse isn't just a weed. It's a legume. That means every thorny bush growing on that ruined hillside was quietly doing something the land desperately needed, pulling nitrogen from the air and locking it into the soil, for free, at scale, on land that decades of farming had stripped bare. But the nitrogen was only half the story. Gorse grows into a wall, 3 meters tall, dense, and armed with spines sharp enough to draw blood. To a farmer, that's a nuisance. To a sheep or a goat, it's impassable. And to a fragile native seedling trying to take root underneath it, it's a fortress. Wilson documented exactly this in a 1994 study published in the New Zealand Journal of Botany. Seedlings of Kanuka and Mahoi, growing safely inside the thorns, completely out of reach of the grazing animals that had eaten every previous generation down to the dirt. The plant everyone wanted gone was the only thing standing between those seedlings and extinction. But that raised an uncomfortable question. If gorse grows this fast and this dense, what happens when the trees it's protecting need to reach the sun? That question has an answer, and it's the reason this entire experiment worked. Gorse needs full sun to survive, not partial sun, full sun, and that single requirement turned out to be its own death sentence. Underneath the thorns, Kanuka and Mahoi seedlings kept climbing, year after year, sheltered from the animals that would have eaten them. Eventually, they grew taller than the gorse itself, and once native branches pushed up above the canopy, they started stealing the one thing gorse can't live without: direct light. The data backs this up. Old gorse canopy begins collapsing under its own weight after roughly 10 years, once shade from above cuts off its access to sun. Without light, it can't produce new growth. It can't reseed. It just sits there, dying slowly, until it rots down into the forest floor as topsoil. The weed had spent decades building a fortress to protect the very trees that would eventually block out its sun and kill it. But biology wasn't the only threat to Wilson's experiment. While the gorse was quietly collapsing underground, a very different kind of pressure was building above it, from the people living right next door. The pressure wasn't just social. It was legal. Local regulations still classified gorse as a noxious weed, which meant government officials had the authority to force Wilson to spray his own land, to undo, by law, the exact thing his research was proving worked. Then, in 1988, the drought hit. Across the Banks Peninsula, pasture that farmers depended on turned to dust. Cattle that had grazed those hillsides for generations had nothing left to eat. Herds were dying, and neighboring farmers, the same ones who had called Wilson a fool a year earlier, were watching their livestock starve. Wilson's land was different. Whatever cover remained inside his boundaries had kept enough moisture in the soil to hold on, so he opened his gates. The man accused of ruining the peninsula became the only person on it with pasture left to share. Starving cattle grazed on land that was supposed to be worthless. Trust didn't come from an argument. It came from a drought. The legal threats quietly stopped after that. But the hardest part of Wilson's experiment hadn't even started yet. 9 years where nothing, on the surface, seemed to be happening at all. If you'd driven past Heinway any time in the early 1990s, you would have seen exactly what the neighbors predicted. Bright yellow flowers, mile after mile of them. Thorns still standing. To anyone watching from the road, nothing had changed in almost a decade. Wilson kept working anyway. By this point, the reserve had grown past 1,000 hectares, and he managed most of it without a car, cycling 90 kilometers from Christchurch, over and over, to mend fences and clear out pests that slipped through the boundary. He also kept photographing. Fixed-point monitoring surveys, started back in 1988, captured the exact same hillside from the exact same angle, year after year. To the naked eye, the images barely moved. But underneath the gorse, the seedlings were still climbing. Every year, a little taller. Every year, a little closer to the canopy line that would finally choke the weed out for good. 9 years of yellow flowers. 9 years of neighbors assuming the experiment had simply failed quietly, the way most abandoned land does. Then, in 1997, the hillside did something the farmers had sworn was impossible. The same photo point that had shown nothing but yellow flowers for 9 years finally showed something else. Green. Not patches of it, canopy. Kanuka and Mahoy had closed overhead, and beneath them, the gorse that once covered the hillside edge to edge had simply disappeared into the soil. By 2016, the comparison photos told the whole story on their own. Where there had been a solid wall of thorns, there was now layered native rainforest, with no visible gorse at all. By 2026, that forest had spread to 1,700 hectares, 16 times the size of the land Wilson first walked onto. The numbers underneath that canopy are staggering. 350 native plant species, 35 bird species that had abandoned the peninsula, now back. And the valleys that used to run bone dry every summer now hold 47 waterfalls, flowing year-round, because the forest floor finally acts like the sponge it was always meant to be. The reserve now generates roughly 1 million New Zealand dollars a year in carbon credits, without a single seedling ever planted by hand. Wilson didn't restore this land. He removed the pressure on it and let it restore itself. Sometimes the fastest way to fix a broken ecosystem is to simply get out of its way.